Modern-day philosopher, secular prophet, culture war critic, YouTuber, and clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson, known for having strong opinions on almost everything under the sun, from psychology to religion to climate change to biology to beauty, is a darling of millions of people worldwide. For years, Peterson has captured the hearts of many, especially young men who see him as a father figure. Many describe him as having saved their lives. As such, he is as close to his secular Jesus figure today. Even I was once enamored by this man, declaring him as my newest favorite person in 2018. Even though he describes himself as a classical British liberal, his strongest support is mainly from religious right wing and conservative people. His teachings on psychology and personal responsibility carry solid advice for people to put their lives in order.
Just try not to do things you know to be stupid and wrong for a month. And that means not to say things you know to be stupid and wrong as well. Maybe that's the most important thing. Just do it as an experiment. See what happens. And it's so fun because I have people writing to me from all over the world who are saying they're doing that. They're saying, well, I cleaned up my room and then I stopped saying stupid things. And my God, it's like things are way better. It's like, who would have guessed it?
Because of his recorded success in this area, he has now broadened his tentacles to encompass as many fields as are relevant to socio-political discourse today. As usual, his commentary bears the markings of common sense. But if you scratch just beneath the surface of his charismatic and confident persona, you begin to realize something quite odious, which is most of his takes outside the field of psychology can be best described as absurd. What this has revealed is that Peterson seems to be suffering from a very common malady that ails public intellectuals. In this video, we'll be needing the help of everybody's favorite grandpa, Thomas Sowell, to accurately diagnose Peterson's intellectual ailments. Thomas Sowell, in his best-selling book, Intellectuals and Society, made a very astute observation that public intellectuals make the mistake of thinking that competency in one area neatly translates into competency in other areas. He explained this in an interview with Peter Robinson in an episode of Uncommon Knowledge.
Well, let's take an example. Noam Chomsky, whom you write about in Intellectuals and Society, whose work in linguistics, in the first place, I can't understand it, but as best I can tell, everyone who understands his technical work within the field, within his discipline of linguistics, considers him one of the great figures of the 20th century. And his work in politics?
Absurdity. The same could be said of Bertrand Russell and his landmark works on mathematics and other people in other fields, but they step outside their field. And when you step outside your level of specialty, sometimes that's like stepping off a cliff.
What Sowell is saying, using the examples of Noam Chomsky and Bertrand Russell, is that certain intellectuals within their fields of expertise are solid, but the minute they step outside their field of expertise to comment on things beyond their scope, they begin to sound absurd, as their lack of knowledge shows. But why are public intellectuals so easily seduced to opine on matters that they have no expertise in? There are a couple of reasons I can think of, and Thomas Sowell highlights one of them.
And why is it that intellectuals, that is to say people whose end product is ideas, should succumb to that temptation more than, to use your example, a chess grandmaster?
Because a chess grandmaster can be world famous for doing absolutely nothing more than winning chess tournaments and making displays, as many of them do, of playing 5 chess games simultaneously while blindfolded.
So Bobby Fischer had no need to opine on the politics of the day because he was getting rich and famous and making a brilliant career for himself within his narrow profession.
That's right.
In addition to the points that Thomas Sowell just made, I think part of the reason is that public intellectuals often overestimate their competency, sometimes deluding themselves into thinking that expertise in their field makes them as qualified to give expert opinion in other areas. This often occurs as they start getting recognition and accolades for their brilliance in their field. When people begin to ask them questions on other areas, and instead of being humble enough to admit their lack of expertise and knowledge in those areas, they try to come up with smart answers. Back to Jordan Peterson. After rising to fame following his defiance of Bill C-16, his viral interview with Cathy Newman, and the release of his best-selling book 12 Rules for Life, which is a very good book, by the way. He's transformed himself into an expert in a wide range of topics, which he speaks on passionately and confidently, almost too confidently. But anyone discerning enough to look critically at some of Peterson's claims will quickly notice the lack of intellectual depth, misrepresentation of ideas, serial strawmanning, and deft dodging of questions by being so vague that his words could mean nothing or a million different things. So let's take a deep dive into some of the problems with Jordan Peterson, and I will try to suppress my urge to mock him. So help me God. Perhaps the easiest area to reveal Peterson's lack of understanding is on the topic of religion, and specifically on Christianity and the nature of God. Fundamentally, Peterson does not understand Christianity and has a tendency of mythologizing and philosophizing it, things that the Bible strictly warns against. For example, here's Peterson talk about the figure of Christ. Watch as he describes Christ as a partly mythological figure.
So what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived, plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief, and I don't understand it.
Nothing about the life of Christ, including his virgin birth to his resurrection, is mythological to Christians. According to the Christian worldview, these things literally happened. In this next clip, it talks about how a person's hierarchy of values is synonymous with God for them.
You have a hierarchy of values. You have to. Otherwise, you can't act, or you're painfully confused. You have a hierarchy of values. Whatever is at the top of that hierarchy of values serves the function of God for you. Now, it may be a God that you don't believe in, or a God that you can't name, but it doesn't matter, because it's God for you.
The idea that God and Christ are literal and not mythological beings in any sense is fundamental to Christians of all denominations, no matter what these denominations disagree on. No Christian conceives of God as a hierarchy of values or some metaphysical gibberish. They consider him to be a real and literal being who created everything in existence without exception. Peterson has made God into an idea, into anything a person wants him to be. Isn't that a postmodernist stance, where epistemic certainty and stability of meaning is rejected? If God means different things to different people, then is that God? Now, I can grant that he makes these mistakes because he's not a Christian, but could he just be humble about it instead of speaking like an authority on Christianity? Peterson's conception of God and Christ are totally at odds with Christianity. He did something similar when he put it to Matt Dillahunty, an atheist, that despite being an atheist, Matt was really a closeted Judeo-Christian to the core, just because he shared some moral values that Christians happen to share.
This is the argument I've had with people like Sam Harris, the atheist types. It's like, yeah, you think you're atheist, man. It's like, you're Christian, Judeo-Christian, let's say, to the core.
I actually don't believe in a God, and I could write
But you act
poetry.
like you do.
Huh?
But you act like you do. That's why you didn't
I
want to
act
throw
like-
Sam off the stage.
No, now you're making a claim. Okay, so I'm telling you I don't believe there's a God, and
Yeah.
your response to that is, I really do, because I have a moral sense. But my moral sense is utterly without any appeal to a God.
Now, who's going to tell Peterson that in Christianity, those values count for nothing without a corresponding belief in God and Christ? Finally, on religion, to prove Peterson is just a bullshitter, when answering a question on whether he believes in God in an interview with Mohammed Ijab, this was his response.
No, so people say to me, do you believe in God? And I think, okay, there's a couple of mysteries in that question. What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe? And what do you mean God? And you say as the questioner, well, we already know what all those things mean, except belief in God. And I think, no, if we're going to get down to the fundamental brass tacks, we don't really know what any of those things mean. And so for me, belief, for example, is often reflected not so much in proposition as it is in action. If I want to know what you believe, I could ask you, and hopefully you have some idea about what you believe, but I'd rather see what you do.
Well, can I push back a little bit with this? Because, like, for example, when I was reading your book, your newest book, actually this time, 12 More Rules. They're very good books, by the way. I mean, I recommend
Thank
them,
you, sir.
honestly. So one thing you mentioned in the book, you were talking about some psychological theory, which I don't forget. I forget what it is right now. But you mentioned something. You said this, the problem with this such and such theory is that it doesn't have any evidence. Full stop. Categorical. All this, what you're doing now, you didn't mention that. You didn't say, well, it depends on what you mean by this. It depends on what you... Sorry to say, yeah. But it depends on what you mean by this. It depends on what you mean. You become postmodern all of a sudden.
Mohammed Isjab was right to call out Peterson here. How is this any different from Ketanji Brown's answer on what is a woman? Just because Peterson didn't want to give an answer, he responded with such a ridiculous statement.
What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe? And what do you mean God?
Perhaps Peterson could speak with more humility on things he clearly knows little about, but knowing him, he won't. Peterson is on record saying that the idea that women were oppressed throughout history is an appalling theory. Anyone who has listened to him defend the patriarchy would think that life was equally terrible for men and women throughout history. Emphasis on equally.
This whole patriarchy thing, I think you have no idea how pernicious and dangerous it is.
Well, no, I don't.
Men
I
and
really don't.
women
Go on.
throughout history have fundamentally cooperated to push back against the absolute catastrophe of existence. A terrible death rate, the probability of chronic starvation, early death, disease, the difficulty of raising children with all the death that was associated with that. And to look backwards in time and say, well, basically what happened was men took the upper hand and persecuted women in this tyrannical patriarchy. It's absolutely dreadful misreading of history. It's a terrible thing to teach young women, and it's a horrible thing to inflict upon men.
By today's standards, life was terrible for everyone, even for kings. But that does not negate the fact that women had it worse in so many ways than men. This is an inconvenient truth that Peterson is simply refusing to accept. His view is just as dogmatic as the claims he's trying to debunk. On the one hand, legal feminists refuse to acknowledge that despite the horrors against women in history, there was incredible cooperation between men and women. Peterson, on the other hand, is refusing to concede that despite such cooperations, women still had it worse than men in many ways. Both things are not mutually exclusive. Here are a few examples of how bad women had it in the past. And these are not even the worst or an exhaustive list. In the US, married women were not regarded as separate legal entities from their husbands until the 19th century. Similarly, they were not accepted into universities until the 19th century. On voting, women only secured the right to vote in 1918. And this did not even include all women. Most shockingly, as late as 1973, women were not allowed to open a bank account or have a mortgage without the co-signing of a man. In the light of all this, Peterson's claim that life was equally bad for everyone back in the day makes absolutely no sense as a response to the question on the historical horrors of the patriarchy. This is like saying just because Bill Gates has some challenges in life, then life is just as terrible for him as the homeless guy on the street. A bit hyperbolic, but you get the point. While we can recognize that a lot of progress has been made on gender equality, with women today being freer than at any other time in human history, the assertion that history was marked by patriarchal oppression of women is mostly correct. This should not be an excuse to demonize men, but it is simply just true. The truth must be said, however inconvenient it is. Another absolutely ridiculous thing that Peterson has said is that ancient civilizations were informed about the nature of the DNA because they had pictures of things that were intertwined and looked like the double helix structure of DNA.
Cool, this representation. So you see the sort of the primary mother and father of humanity emerging from this underlying snake-like entity with its tails tangled together. I think that's I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA. So, and that representation, that entwined double helix, that is everywhere. You can see it in Australian Aboriginal art, and I'm using the Australians as an example because they were isolated in Australia for like 50,000 years. They're the most archaic people that were ever discovered, and they have clear representations of these double helix structures in their art. So, and those are the two giant serpents out of which the world is made, roughly speaking. It's the same thing, you see that in the staff of Asclepius, which is the healing symbol that physicians use, although usually that's only one snake, but sometimes it's two.
Peterson makes such leaps of logic that can only be characterized as fictional or the products of a deranged mind. Ancient depictions of intertwined snakes have absolutely nothing to do with knowledge about DNA. He does similar things with his lobster analogy.
So these creatures engage in dominance disputes, and I think dominance is the right way to think about it because lobsters aren't very empathic and they're not very social, and so it really is the toughest lobster that wins. And what's so cool about the lobster is that when a lobster wins, he flexes and gets bigger, so he looks bigger because he's a winner. It's like he's advertising that, and the neurochemical system that makes him flex is serotonergic. And you think, well, who cares? What the hell does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means. It's the same chemical that's affected by antidepressants in human beings. And so, like, if you're depressed, you're a defeated lobster. Like, you're like this. I'm small. I'm not, things are dangerous. I don't want to fight. You give someone an antidepressant, it's like up they stretch, and then they're ready to, like, take on the world again. Well, if you give lobsters who just got defeated in a fight serotonin, then they stretch out and they'll fight again. And that's, like, we separated from those creatures on the evolutionary timescale somewhere between 350 and 600 million years ago, and the damn neurochemistry is the same.
Just because something was true for a supposed human ancestor millions of years ago doesn't make it true for humans today. Because guess what? If that was the case, we'd all still be lobsters. Lobsters pee out of their faces. Should that be the correct way for humans to pee? His obsession with meta-narratives and evolutionary psychology allows him to make these absurd claims about social issues, such as his claim that the purpose of makeup is to simulate sexual arousal, all in a bid to question the validity of men and women working together because of workplace sexual assault.
Why do you make your lips red? Because they turn red during sexual arousal. That's why. Why do you put rouge on your cheeks? Same reason.
Peterson supposes that humans are primarily driven by instinct. If the purpose of makeup is to simulate sexual arousal, does it mean that men who work with women cannot control themselves, that they have to sexually assault women in the workplace on account of being sexually provoked? What about men's haircuts? Many women usually say a haircut is like makeup for men. Should men not have a haircut for fear of seducing the women at work? This is also obviously ridiculous, but he says it with such an air of confidence and finality that some people just lap it up without question. A surprising one, though, is Peterson's crusade on online anonymity. Recently, he launched a war on online anonymity, attacking people with anonymous Twitter accounts as demonic trolls. That Peterson does not understand the need for some people to be anonymous online reveals just how much removed from reality, as well as how much of an egomaniac he is. While anonymous accounts can be a pain in the ass, and I rarely engage with such accounts on Twitter, that people could lose their jobs, credibility, and social connections by sharing an unpopular or taboo opinion online is a real concern that Peterson, because of his secure financial position and privilege, feels confident enough to attack and dismiss. It's easy to be brave when you have a guaranteed stream of income that would never go away no matter what you say online. Not everybody has that luxury. Lastly, Peterson repeatedly superimposes his worldview on other people's motivations, like his theory that Putin's war in Ukraine is a civilizational civil war being fought by Putin to combat the spread of wokeness from the West to Russia. Really?
And are we degenerate in a profoundly threatening manner? I think the answer to that may well be yes. The idea that we are ensconced in a culture war has become a rhetorical commonplace. How serious is that war? Is it serious enough to increase the probability that Russia, say, will be motivated to invade and potentially incapacitate Ukraine merely to keep the pathological West out of that country, which is a key part of the historically Russian sphere of influence?
Such a reductionist view of geopolitics to culture war narratives is so insane, it's unbelievable that it's coming from an educated person. But let me leave this analysis to Vlad Vexler to explain it better.
Jordan Peterson's argument is that there is a problem of authoritarian, neo-Marxist, postmodern identity politics in the West. Now, over 50% of that classification, or about 50% of that classification, is bogus. I can't get into that now. So how shall we put this question? Is Jordan conceiving of the phenomena correctly? No. Is Jordan focusing on a phenomena that's actually real at all? Or is it imaginary? Is it something that's concocted on the right, for example, the idea that there is this problem of wokeism and that there is a real political crisis of hyper-identity politics? The phenomenon is real. The phenomenon is really, really real. It's misconceived in some ways by Jordan, but the phenomenon is real. So that's what I would say. There's something Jordan's pointing to, he's misconceiving it, but it's real. Now, Peterson is saying this is to some extent either being used by Putin as an excuse to invade Ukraine, rile up the Russian population with this sort of fear-mongering about the West just losing the plot with identity politics. Or indeed it might be that Putin really believes in this and that he is fighting a kind of civilizational battle against the West and is on the anti-woke side, and therefore what you've got to say is that in part the Ukraine war is a civil war for Peterson. It's in part a working out of a conflict that's within the United States, a political issue, within the United Kingdom, a political issue. And so, I mean, you see where this is going. This is an absolutely fatuous and empty and obviously highly humiliating projection of some local political challenges onto a very important conflict in which people are dying. Now, Peterson is not wrong that Putin has had a go at wokeism and that Putin has had a go at Western identity politics, and that to some extent his regime has milked this to generate anti-Western sentiment. Sure. Is this playing any role of substance in the Ukraine invasion? No, none. Just none. And I think there is something not ethically but aesthetically yuck about even trying to justify this, because the correct response to this argument by Peterson is just to shrug one's shoulders and either say, oh gosh, this is just so unlovely and ugly, or to say, yeah, this is really bad, I want to give Jordan a hug, he's not doing well with this. And what you do depends on your sensibility. But there is no way we're going to make an argument against this. That would be just bizarre. It's just, you don't argue against that. It's a particularly appalling sort of faceplant at the level of, I've spent 7 days in China and now I'm going to be a Chinese expert. Or I've spent 2 days in Ukraine, I'm going to be Ukraine expert. You often have Western quasi-celebrity academics doing this all the time. Often making TV series about countries and spending 3 weeks in that country to make the TV series. And in fact, they know just absolutely zero about that place. And everything they say is just absolutely trivial at best and wrong at worst. So no, we're not going to go there.
Peterson has unraveled as a deeply psychologically disturbed and angry man. And in a way, I feel sorry for him because he clearly needs psychological help. His mind is broken, and every minute that passes bears the risk that nothing of the original man would remain soon enough. So that's the video. If you like what we do on this channel, consider becoming a channel member or patron. However, your likes, shares, and views are just as valued.